Public discussion of Supreme Court actions often begins and ends with a vote tally, but that habit can hide more than it reveals. An 8-to-1 split sounds decisive, and headlines frequently treat it as a final judgment on constitutional meaning. Yet the law does not work that way, especially when the court is operating through its emergency docket. The first hook is this disconnect between perception and procedure. In the situation at hand, the court declined Missouri Desist's request to temporarily lift a lower court injunction affecting the state's Second Amendment Preservation Act. That refusal has been framed as a sweeping rejection of gun rights claims, even though the order addressed only whether the court should intervene early while normal appeals continue. The decision did not evaluate the constitutionality of the statute itself, nor did it settle the broader questions surrounding state and federal authority. It simply left an existing injunction in place while the Eighth Circuit continues to review the case. Keeping that procedural context in mind is essential, because emergency orders are designed to manage timing and stability, not to announce final interpretations of the Constitution. Before moving deeper, it helps to restate the narrow issue the court actually decided, in one's own words, to separate what was ruled on from what was not. Understanding that limited scope reshapes how the vote count should be read. Chief Justice Roberts joined several conservative justices in denying the stay, while Justice Clarence Thomas dissented and would have granted immediate relief. That alignment has fueled speculation about shifting commitments, but such conclusions overlook how often the court chooses restraint at this stage. On the emergency docket, the justices weigh factors like whether intervention is necessary to prevent irreparable harm before lower courts finish their work. They are not obligated to preview how they will rule on the merits later. This is the second hook. Judicial restraint can look like rejection if the process is ignored. Observers benefit from tracking how the court has used this posture to avoid premature decisions, particularly in politically sensitive cases. An educational pause here invites viewers to compare emergency standards with merits review, noting how different legal questions dominate each phase. The Missouri request was denied not because the law was declared unconstitutional, but because the court chose not to disrupt the appellate process already underway. That distinction is subtle but foundational to understanding what the order does and does not signal. The design of Missouri's law explains why the dispute has attracted national attention. House Bill 85 was not framed as a symbolic statement. It aimed to alter how state and local authorities interact with federal agencies by declaring certain federal firearm restrictions unenforceable within Missouri, and by barring state and local officers from assisting federal enforcement of those restrictions. Practical effects follow from that structure, such as denying access to local facilities, communication systems, or personnel support. The statute's most controversial element, however, is its enforcement mechanism. Instead of relying on state officials, it authorizes private individuals to sue state or local entities that cooperate with federal enforcement, imposing mandatory financial penalties and legal fees. This is the third hook. Enforcement power is deliberately shifted away from the state and into private hands. Viewers can deepen their understanding by noting how enforcement design influences judicial review, particularly when a law seeks to insulate itself from direct state action. Missouri lawmakers modeled this approach on a strategy used elsewhere, reasoning that if private enforcement could delay judicial review in one context, it might operate similarly here. The law's architects anticipated that courts might hesitate to block a statute that the state itself does not enforce. That strategy triggered a swift federal response. The Department of Justice argued that Missouri's law violates the supremacy principle by obstructing federal operations and penalizing cooperation with federal authorities. A federal district judge agreed and issued a broad injunction blocking the statute's enforcement. Importantly, the injunction attempted to reach not only state officials but also private citizens, stating that they too could not bring lawsuits under the law. Missouri appealed, lost at the circuit level, and then sought emergency relief from the Supreme Court. The denial of that request is what generated the headlines, but the accompanying concurring statement by Justice Gorsuch, joined by Justice Alito, is what shifted the analytical landscape. This is the fourth hook. The scope of an injunction matters as much as its existence. Justice Gorsuch focused on a technical but significant point of law. An injunction directed at a state and its officers does not automatically bind private individuals who were not parties to the case. That observation does not guarantee that private lawsuits would succeed, nor does it endorse them. It simply clarifies that the lower court's order may not reach as far as it intended. An educational exercise here is to trace who is legally bound by a court order and why the boundary exists, paying attention to how courts define the limits of their authority. This clarification reframes the practical effects of the Supreme Court's action. State officials remained barred from enforcing the law, and the state attorney general cannot assist private litigants. Yet uncertainty persists about whether private citizens could file suits on their own. That uncertainty itself can shape behavior. Local officials may hesitate to cooperate with federal agencies if they fear potential liability, even if the ultimate legality of such suits remains unresolved. Justice Thomas's dissent highlights a contrasting perspective, suggesting that the lower court's injunction warranted immediate correction. Meanwhile, the case returns to the Eighth Circuit, where the central dispute will focus on the anti-commandeering doctrine. Missouri argues it is merely declining to provide assistance, an option the Supreme Court has recognized for states. The federal government counters that the law goes further by punishing cooperation, crossing the line from refusal into obstruction. This is the fifth hook. The boundary between declining to help and actively penalizing help becomes the core legal question. Observers can sharpen their analysis by watching how the appellate court articulates that distinction and how it weighs the competing claims of state sovereignty and federal supremacy. As the process continues, the episode illustrates how constitutional disputes evolve through procedural stages, how interim decisions can influence real-world behavior, and why careful attention to judicial reasoning is essential for understanding what has truly been decided and what remains open.